least nominally, if you just look at economic growth published by the government, will probably be the strongest in the world. So the government's hoping for 8%. Most sort of these iBank type economists are saying that, well, maybe 6.5 to 7%. And most serious independent economists are saying that, you know, maybe 4%. Nonetheless, that is still probably the highest in the world, with Japan now definitely going to have negative growth this year, the US negative growth, Europe negative growth, and much of the developed world too. So if China is not going to have the strongest growth this year, will be among the strongest. Nonetheless, there are many underlying problems facing China, both external and internal. And I think the U.S., it's not time, and a lot of people say, well, China's getting so strong, you know, it's time for the U.S. to step back. We're not quite to this point yet. We're far from that point, actually. So even though we owe China, you know, trillions of dollars or whatever, still the U.S. has a lot of capacities and should not shirk from its international duty. There could well be major international shocks emanating from Asia in the next few years. And really the only power that can deal with these kinds of shocks is the United States. So first I'm going to talk about external concerns, and then I'm going to talk about internal, possible internal shocks in China. On external shocks, the biggest problem out there, as Professor Witte mentioned briefly, is North Korea. So North Korea, many of you know, is ruled by a dictatorship of the most extreme kind. Dear leader Kim Jong-il is the leader of North Korea. And as far as we know, he has more or less absolute power in the country. The problem with these kinds of regimes is that if the leader gets sick or if he dies, then that creates a big problem. And so he had a stroke basically earlier this year. I mean, he's apparently recovered from the stroke. But nonetheless, you know, years of hard drinking, smoking, womanizing, and eating is taking a heavy toll on his health. There's actually, I want to do a project on like a public health thing on like corruption's impact on leaders' health. We'll leave it to the economists to do that maybe. Find some kind of clever instrumental variable and like look at that. But anyway, he's an extreme case. He's suffered, you know, he's not that old, but he's apparently not in good health. When he passes away, you know, we all die, right? In the long run, we're all dead. Famous economists. When he dies, we expect political instability in North Korea because there's no apparent successor in the regime. The U.S. has a plan. The U.S. in conjunction with South Korea has a plan to deal with this eventuality. And we can assume that China, being of course bordering North Korea and expecting massive flood of refugees from North Korea if the regime collapses, also has a plan to intervene militarily if necessary in North Korea. The problem is that if the two plans are not coordinated, we could end up accidentally, the US and China could end up accidentally fighting each other in North Korea. And so I suspect that a large reason why Hillary Clinton is going to Japan, Korea, and then China is actually, although nominally the excuse of course is to, you know, improve ties and also to deal with proliferation issues as regarding North Korea, the real reason is to talk with leaders of those countries. What are each country is going to do in the likely event that Kim Jong-il passes away in the next few years? How is the plan going to be coordinated? And this is, I know just from some stuff that I've done, that the US government is thinking very closely about this issue of especially coordinating with the Chinese military. If the Chinese military decides to intervene in a civil war in North Korea, right? So of course China it's easiest for China to intervene because there's no defended border between China and North Korea. So they can easily just move troops into North Korea if the regime collapses. So again, but I think, you know, this is something that the US needs to coordinate. I mean, China has a stake in doing that, but the US can get the South Koreans and the Japanese on board on this issue and really coordinate some kind of plan in the event that Kim Jong-il passes away and that, you know, there's military, like sort of a civil war in North Korea. Okay, so for a long time, of course, Taiwan was potentially a problem between the United States and China. That is not so much of a problem anymore because of the ambiguously pro-unification ruling party now, the Kuomintang, KMT, of course under President Ma Ying-jeou. And so I think for the next few years, this problem will go away, but as many of you know, for a long time, this was potentially a spark in security relations between China and the United States because, of course, the previous ruling party of China, the Democratic Progressive Party, under Chen Shui-bian, who's now in jail now, he's corrupt and, he supposedly took, whatever, hundreds of millions of dollars from the Chinese government. But whenever I talk to Chinese officials, they're always like, who is the cleanest, most honest provincial official in China is? I'm like, I don't know, tell me. It's like Chen Shui-bian is. So, I don't know, that's like a joke. Because people in China are so much more corrupt. So the DPP was, of course, threatening to declare independence or holding a referendum, which they hope would show that the people of Taiwan would like political independence from China, which would have triggered some kind of armed reaction from China. And so, China has thousands of missiles aimed at Taiwan. And, even if they fire a tenth of that, Taipei will lay in ruins. But this scenario is unlikely now in the next few years because the president now is nominally pro-unification with China. Of course, over the long term, there's no deadline, no whatsoever, but the level of tension between Taiwan and China, and therefore between the US and China, has decreased substantially on that front. Other possible flashpoints internationally include China and Vietnam and Philippines over the Spratlys, which is oil. But again, because oil prices has basically tanked, that's not so much a concern anymore. The West continues to be very dissatisfied with, of course, Chinese treatment of Tibet, and also Chinese help of Burmese dictators. But I think that those are secondary issues. I mean, of course, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State now, says that she will tackle these issues, but I think these are basically secondary issues for the United States. And, so maybe there'll be some symbolic gesture, but I don't think it's going to be a big source of tension. So externally, the main thing that we're looking at in the next few years is North Korea. Actually, it's the most likely thing that's going to cause trouble. Now we turn to domestic issues. So of course, now the world's mainly worried about the impact of China's rise to the world economy and also politically. But I think we shouldn't forget that on a per capita basis, China is still a pretty poor country. And of course, if you include purchasing power parity, they're richer. But there's still, tens of millions of extremely poor people. And if you set the poverty line at $2 a day, which is also another definition of poverty, there's still, I think, hundreds of millions of people in China who are living in poverty. So, and also empirically, countries in this range of economic growth, that's sort of between 1,000 and sort of 8,000 US dollars GDP per capita, has experienced the most political instability. So if you look back in the post-war world, countries like in Latin America, Chile, Argentina, South Korea, which lived under dictatorships, had many coups, they experienced political instability, not when they're extremely poor, and of course, very few countries experience political instability when they're very rich, but they all experience political instability in this range where they're sort of lower middle income. I'm not saying that there is any sort of causal relationship, but it certainly is cause for us to be more cautious before we declare that China has sort of made it into developed world. That China is very far from that, in fact. I think one of the biggest problems facing China today is that, in fact, the economy, despite many elements which look a lot like the market economy, is in fact still mainly a quasi-socialist economy. And by that, I mean that most of the capital in the economy, so capital being infrastructure, financial resources, is still controlled by the state. So if you think about construction projects in China, it's mainly financed by the state. All the banks are owned by the state. Most of the brokerages are owned by the state. Most of the insurance companies are owned by the state. So all financial capital was actually allocated by the state. And of course,